hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. What if the cyborg and the zombie represent flip sides of a giant problem humanity is facing right now? A problem so huge that we as a global community, just like the climate catastrophe or any other of the looming disasters, try to repress it. Because it's so overwhelming that despite knowing that doing so will seal our doom, we still rather not deal with it. The huge problem I'm talking about here is what Sylvia Wynter would call that the answer to the question of who we are, we give ourselves, leaves us helpless. And today, with this presentation, I hope to help identify the root of this problem so that we collectively can work a way out of this and reclaim our future. But let's start with a simple question. If you were faced with the choice of becoming a cyborg or a zombie tomorrow, what would you choose? For some of us, the cyborg embodies an empowering way to imagine human agency in a seemingly inevitable, more and more technological future where sooner or later humans will merge with machines. For some, like Elon Musk, the probably most famous transhumanist of our times, becoming a cyborg and fleeing the Earth to colonize Mars represents the only hope for human survival. He believes in a future where AI will give rise to the singularity, or as it's sometimes called, the intelligence explosion, which, according to him, despite its rather inspiring name, threatens to turn us all into pets of machines and the world into paperclips. If you asked me, that sounds a bit crazy. But anyway, even Stephen Hawking, one of science's greatest minds, was worried about the singularity. And if that's so, it's maybe safe to say that the cyborg, fusing human consciousness with information technology under shiny armor, at least represents some kind of hope for humanity. Whereas the zombie, most of us associate with a racist colonial past, a hopeless capitalist present, or an apocalyptic future where biotech will turn us all into monsters and that quite probably no human will ever survive. So who in their right mind would ever choose to be a zombie? Well, I would. And in the next half an hour, I will argue not only that the cyborg has been hijacked by dark forces that behind its shiny armor promote a future built on white supremacy, race science, eugenics, and social Darwinism, but that it's often misunderstood and upside down, yet almost identical twin, the zombie, offers a more appealing answer to our questions about ourselves, our future, our fears and hopes and dreams. Since I'm fairly certain that you're all familiar with various pop culture appearances of our two unlikely twins, I will start by introducing quickly the philosophies that stand behind each of them and talk about the ideology that links them both together. In the second part, I will, with the help of Sylvia Wynter, explore the roots and history of this ideology we are all familiar with under the name of the law of nature. And finally, I will show you how by embracing the zombie, we might become able again to imagine a bright and collaborative future that includes all of human beings. Let's start with the zombie. The maybe oldest conception of the zombie myth we in the Western world are familiar with is the idea that it expressed the horrors of colonial slavery. Horrors which were so dreadful and inhumane that it caused enslaved Africans to fear that even death might not free them from their burdens, and that they could be forced to work and suffer for infinity. But today, zombies, or the undead, are less known for their exploitable work power, although they maybe should be, than for being unconscious automatons with an insatiable urge to consume human flesh. We all know them from various TV shows and movies where they are portrayed as an infectious and deadly threat that their former kin and even family members are supposed to kill to survive without any mercy or moral considerations. So it might come as a surprise to some that the zombie has a long philosophical history where it doesn't eat brains and looks rather different. Like this, or this. Yes, in philosophy, the living dead look and act exactly like us. It all started with Rene Descartes, who lived in the 17th century. And you may know for his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." He lived during what is called the scientific revolution and believed that non-human animals were mere machines, automata whose behavior could be wholly explained in terms of physical mechanisms. But for him, distinctively human behavior could not be explained that way. It required something extra, something beyond the physical, an immaterial mind. Descartes believed that if we all suddenly lost our minds, our bodies might continue to function for a while, the same way as our hearts keep beating and we keep breathing and digesting food while we are asleep. And that we might even be able to walk around in a mindless sort of way. But that without our minds, we wouldn't have what makes us human. Yes, Descartes did everything short of spelling out the idea of zombies. And he did so because he wanted to show that humans are more than machines. But 200 years later, in the 19th century, the Enlightenment had left its mark, and scientists began to be convinced that science, as in physics, should be able to explain everything. They believed in a world closed under causation, meaning that all physical events had a physical cause. And so neurophysiology set out to explain even human behavior. But there was one quite big problem, one science even today still grapples with: consciousness. Phenomena of consciousness are hard to account for in physical terms. And when physicalism or materialism claimed that consciousness involves only physical processes, these scientists had to conclude something very counterintuitive. Namely, that consciousness, since it can't be measured in physical terms, had to have no effect on the physical world. What this means is that human beings were reduced to being conscious machines, and consciousness to a causally inert byproduct, meaning it didn't matter. Humans were stripped of their agency. But erasing human agency, and with it making finding a purpose in life quite difficult, wasn't the most baffling consequence of this conclusion. It also entailed that, at least in theory, it should be possible for physical organisms to exist, people just like us, but lacking consciousness. It made a zombie world possible. A world whose physical processes are closed under causation and exactly duplicate those in our actual world, but where there are no conscious experiences. A world against all common sense, in which human bodies without consciousness and ever experiencing anything would still have gone through the motions of building cities, making and using bridges, telephones and telegraphs, the internet, the web, in short, all of the things we do. Hard to swallow, isn't it? But since zombies are such a powerful counterexample to contest physicalism in general, a lot of arguments were made to back up this intuition that they should be possible, or at least conceivable. Because if they are not, we would have to question a lot about how science explains human behavior. And if a zombie world still sounds more absurd than conceivable to you, remember that today's dominant theory of the human mind is still founded on physicalism. Which brings us to the cyborg and the lately so hyped fear of a looming singularity. If the zombie is a human machine stripped of consciousness, The cyborg is the idea that human consciousness could be merged with a physical machine. I hope it becomes clear now why I see these two as inverted twins. Both are seen as machines, one lacking consciousness and the other wants to have it. What I will outline next is how losing agency and a sense of purpose laid the foundation for what could be called a religious fundamentalism, by which transhumanists propose technology as our only savior. But first, let's look at what humanity apparently needs saving from, the singularity. The singularity is a kind of supernatural being, a machine that surpasses human-level intelligence and whose possibility rests on the question whether one believes that the human brain is a machine or not. If it is, scientists will sooner or later figure out how it works and, equipped with that knowledge, might become able to turn dead matter into life. But for the singularity to happen, artificial intelligence will have to become conscious of itself. People who spread fear about the singularity believe that neuroscience will very soon be able to explain not only the brain, but consciousness, by figuring out how neural processes carry and transfer information. Or one could say, by simply looking and measuring the computational and neural facts and functionality of our brain. If they succeed, the brain could be modeled by computers and should give rise to an independent artificial consciousness, the singularity. But despite that neuroscience has made impressive advances in mapping what goes on in our brains, one should remember that the brain contains about 85 billion neurons, which is close to the number of the stars in the Milky Way and seems quite a lot. Especially if you think about that not only will scientists have to figure out what each of these neurons does, but how they all interact together. We're talking about at least 100 trillion synapses, and to make it even harder, how these neurons interact and are connected is slightly different in each and any of us. But even if we were anywhere close to having all of this figured out, it still wouldn't explain how all these interactions give rise to a subjective experience. As neuroscientist Joy Hirsch explains, we don't even understand how the brain creates colors. I don't know that your perception of blue is like my perception of blue. Or take smells. I don't know that your perception of a smell of an orange is like mine. These are the hard problems of neuroscience and philosophy that we haven't made a great deal of progress on. So what this all comes down to is that despite all the progress, we still don't have the slightest idea how the brain creates consciousness and what is called qualia, or how it feels like to be you and perceive the world right now in this moment. Qualia, or the ability to turn sensory input or triggered emotions into feelings and reflection, is an essential part of consciousness, and yet we still have no idea how it happens. And if this is where science stands, how could it be that the singularity is perceived as such an immediate and deadly threat? Personally, what I find the most puzzling about this is that if you take the singularity's media presence as an indicator, it seems more scientists are interested in solving the problem of how to create life from dead matter than, for example, stopping the climate catastrophe and the millions of human deaths that will accompany it. This bothered me quite a lot, and so I began investigating the philosophy that informs the alarmist claims of such prominent figures like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, who believe that the only way to deal with this menace of a looming singularity is either enhancing our cognitive abilities by implanting technology in our brains, becoming cyborgs, or directly uploading our minds into machines and becoming immortal. So let's talk about transhumanism. Most people, transhumanists included, would probably say transhumanism is the belief that the human self and body can be improved by merging it with technology and through it, ultimately, transcend its mere humanity. becoming immortal. Transhumanists believe that if the singularity becomes real before we are anywhere close to this goal, that humans would be utterly unprepared to compete with their own creation. And to understand the fear they are spreading, it's important to highlight one little word in this last sentence: compete. Because the Enlightenment not only gave rise to the scientific method that brought us physicalism and stripped human consciousness of any agency, it also gave rise to Darwin's theory of evolution and Malthus's concept of natural scarcity. In short, it reduced individual and collective human life to competition in Darwin's famous struggle for existence. And when you elevate this struggle for life to an ideology, what you get is libertarians. So behind the shiny surface of the transhumanist cyborg dream, that's exactly what I found. For example, Max Moore, who calls himself the founder of modern transhumanism and who created the pro-actionary principle, a principle that turns consumer into lab rats by claiming that innovation and becoming immortal is so important that there should be no regulation on putting whatever product on the market. And that if anybody gets hurt by an untested medicine, for example, you just pay by the profits gained for those human damages. Or take Peter Thiel, who allegedly funds experiments of harvesting and transfusing young people's blood to help old rich people live longer. Or Professor Steve Fuller, who claims that people who oppose diverting public resources to developing life extension technologies should be seen as zombies. Zombies whose most attractive option for dealing with has always been killing. But since genocide is still politically controversial, what one hopes, transhumanists are therefore struck having to convince these underdeveloped, less valuable people to become fully alive. It's not only a despicable social Darwinism that it reveals itself here, but the surprising fact that despite transhumanists being stark Darwinists, they seem to believe in a purpose of life. For Fuller, becoming fully alive, becoming conscious, is to recognize humanity's purpose or end goal, to overcome death and become immortal. And this is surprising, because if you take the perspective of Darwinism, you would try to avoid talking about a human goal or purpose, because the fundamental idea in Darwinism, Darwinist thinking, is that the purposes were thought of discovered as things evolved, selecting certain kinds of behavior, routine behavior, because they were good, or providing an advantage for winning the struggle for life. So what I tried to show so far is that this, our dominant scientific worldview, reducing us to biological machines, has left us with a gaping hole inside, transhumanists included. Most of us have a hard time finding a meaning in life, so much so that now even people who elevate the essence of this reduction as their sole purpose start inventing a supernatural being to worship and be afraid of just to find a meaning. I think what makes itself visible here is that humanity has always relied on telling itself a story of a supernatural order responsible for the laws that govern our world and its power structures. The transhumanists' need to prove that consciousness is physical is like trying to prove once and for all that physicalism's conscious biological machines is really all we are. And Darwinism's taboo of thinking about why and what for we have evolved to have consciousness, a consciousness that makes us storytellers, that constantly seek for a meaning, reveals itself as the contradiction that it is. And science becomes visible as yet another belief system, one with churches that worship a new God, created by humans, but as unstoppable and almighty as all the ones we've known before. But this blurring of science with religion not only becomes visible in transhumanism's fierce technological determinism, it also shows itself in all of us. How we helplessly watch how technology eats our rights, welfare and privacy, and in our cynicism and refusal to imagine anything different. If we are merely biological machines fighting over resources and who gets to procreate, we won't make it. We all know that. So what does it mean when the most hopeful future in the public mainstream is abandoning Earth to colonize Mars or becoming immortal and uploading our minds into machines? How many of us and who will get to live that dream? A couple of weeks ago, I listened to an interview with Jordan Peterson where he claims that if one enforced true equality, what would follow is that people would lose their reason for living, and that all that would be left is suffering. Suffering. It's such a remarkable statement, and I don't think he's referring to physical pain here, but what in religious terms might be called a suffering of the human soul. He seems to be convinced that there cannot be any other meaning or purpose in life except the natural, self-interested Darwinian fight. I think understanding this pain is important because what humanity needs isn't any more fighting, but persuasion and a better story. A story against all common sense of a world in which human bodies build cities, made and used bridges, telephones and telegraphs, the internet, the web, all without ever being conscious of what they are doing. A zombie world, but a zombie world that finally wakes up. Sylvia Wynter holds that this huge problem we are facing right now is the challenge to envision a new science, a science of the word. A challenge comparable to the one made by Copernicus, when against the hegemonic Christian worldview, he declared that the earth moves. And with this realization undermined the church's entire plan for salvation. This is a challenge where we will have to come to realize the importance of our stories. For the beauty of Darwinian thinking is not only that one gets a tool for understanding the world, but also, maybe more importantly, a way of how to define good. And Wynter reminds us that good as well as purpose were once words which meaning and value were defined by the church. She shows how our societies were always defined by mirroring the laws of an half-scientific, half-imagined, supernatural order, and that the relationship between religion and the secularization, and with its science, needs to be understood historically as a story. If we want a future where the answer to the question of who we are includes everyone, we need to understand how the first time Western man became an overrepresentation of what it means to be human. We need to understand how in medieval Christian Europe a scholastic order dictated the concept of man in theological terms, dividing humanity for the first time into true Christian selves and untrue others, and how the story of who we are in a struggle for power already got reinvented twice. The first time during the Renaissance, when humanism was born and Christians set out to sail and explore and colonize the world, establishing the first racial hierarchy, this time by reinventing the divide based on a by nature difference of rationality. And how 200 years later, the Enlightenment with its reductionism, Darwin and Malthus, then demanded the second reinvention. Because the combination of Darwin's theory of evolution with Malthus' concept of natural scarcity not only cemented and naturalized the racial hierarchy, but amplified who would be othered and pushed to the less valued side of the human divide. Because from then on, it included anyone unable to bear and master this law of nature. But we, humans, we are not only regulated by our genes, neither are we mere machines. We are what Wynter calls homo narrans, storytelling, hybrid beings. And the story we tell conditions not only our behavior, but how we do science and study nature. We need to recognize the ambiguity of our current situation that is neither religious nor secular, because if the current configuration of the relationship between religion and secularity is a contingent historical development rather than a law-like historical necessity, then it's all contingent historical developments. It can change. So yes, a zombie world is possible. We are in it. But just like a story, like a magic spell, could turn us humans into zombies. Zombies who feel hope and powerless, not knowing why they are doing what they are doing, but following a supernatural script. Those zombies can awaken and throw away the script, because they come to realize that who makes the script reality is us. And finally, we can reimagine what it means to be human, not by becoming transhuman, reinventing another divide, but by becoming human, by re-enchanting humanism and creating a new post-secular world. A humanism without divisions and degrees that includes everybody and ushers a new world where science supports our meaning. Because what really makes us so special and different from other beings is that we are storytellers. Storytellers who always have been collectively creating the future. So if we want the zombie world to finally awaken, to get out of this nightmare, all we have to do is realize that being human is a praxis. Come alive. Thank you.